What do you do when a country promises you safety and then opens fire on you the very next day? And what does it say about a nation when, after 70 years of staying silent in other people's wars, it finally decides to speak? Before we get into this, hit that like button right now. Not for me, but for the sailors this story is actually about, the ones nobody names in the headlines. Subscribe too, because this is the kind of story that slips past almost every major news outlet, and you'll want to see where it goes next. Here's where it begins. On April 18th, 2 tankers flying the Indian flag were moving through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the busiest and most dangerous stretches of water on the planet. This is international water. Under maritime law, ships from any nation are supposed to pass through freely. No permission needed, no danger expected. That is not how it went. Iranian Revolutionary Guard gunboats opened fire on the vessels. Both ships were forced to abandon their course and turn back. Picture that for a second. You're crewing a commercial tanker, doing an ordinary job, and suddenly there's gunfire aimed at your ship. You don't know if it's a warning shot or the first of many. You don't know if you'll make it home. One of those tankers was carrying close to 2 million barrels of oil. 2 million barrels, redirected at gunpoint, in a strait that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply. Now here's the part that makes this whole event so hard to swallow. Only a day earlier, Iran had signaled that passage through Hormuz would remain open. Iranian officials had pointed to an understanding, tied to a fragile ceasefire, that commercial traffic would be allowed through in a controlled way. Within 24 hours, gunboats were firing on the very ships that Promise was supposed to protect. Iran later gave its own explanation. It said it was reimposing control over the strait because of an American blockade on Iranian shipping, accusing Washington of breaking its own commitments first. Whatever the justification, the outcome for the sailors on those Indian tankers was the same: gunfire, a forced retreat, and a shipping lane that flipped from calm to dangerous in less than a day. This wasn't a lone, isolated flashpoint either. It happened on a day when Iranian gunboats also opened fire on other commercial vessels nearby, and shipping trackers reported an Indian-flagged tanker among the ships forced to turn around. So this was part of a broader, sudden clampdown across the strait. Not one unlucky ship caught in the wrong place. And it wasn't the first warning sign either. For weeks before April 18th, Indian-flagged ships had already been transiting Hormuz under constant watch. India's government had set up a dedicated monitoring operation just to track its sailors moving through that stretch of water. So this attack wasn't some shock out of nowhere. It was the worst version of a risk that India had already been quietly managing for weeks. Now here's where most coverage of this story simply stops. The ship got shot at, the headline ran, and the news cycle moved on. But that's exactly the mistake worth avoiding. Because what India did in response tells you something far bigger than a single incident in a war most people are only half following. India summoned Iran's ambassador. That sentence needs unpacking because summoning an ambassador is not some routine formality. It's one of the sharpest tools available to a country that wants to register serious displeasure without firing a shot. It's diplomacy's version of drawing a hard line in the sand. India's foreign secretary called Iran's ambassador in for direct consultations and communicated what officials described as deep concern over the shooting incident involving the 2 Indian-flagged ships. In diplomatic language, deep concern is never just a shrug. It's a phrase chosen with precision because, in these conversations, every word is weighed for exactly how much pressure it applies. During that meeting, the message was simple but pointed. The safety of Indian sailors and Indian ships in high-risk waters is something New Delhi takes extremely seriously, and Iran's actions had put that safety directly at risk. Read between the lines, and the responsibility for what happened was being placed squarely on Tehran. To understand why this moment carries so much weight, you need to understand something most people outside India don't fully appreciate. For more than 70 years, since gaining independence, India's foreign policy has rested on one central idea: non-alignment. Stay neutral. Avoid picking sides. Refuse to let disputes with any single country spiral into open confrontation. This isn't some minor diplomatic preference tucked away in a policy paper. It shaped how India navigated the entire Cold War, refusing to fully join either the American or Soviet camp while both superpowers tried to pull it in. It shapes how India still balances relationships today with the United States, Russia, and China all at once, something almost no other major country manages to pull off. And it has shaped how India has approached this current war between the United States, Israel, and Iran from the very beginning. India's Ministry of External Affairs made that posture explicit. Discussions about the Hormuz crisis, officials confirmed, had not even been raised formally with the United States. The country's long-standing position is that it takes part in international military operations only under a United Nations mandate, not by joining any single country's coalition. That's not a vague internal instinct. That is a publicly stated decades-old position, and it has held steady through enormous shifts in the global balance of power. At one point during this crisis, the President of the United States publicly asked countries around the world to send warships to help secure the Strait of Hormuz, India did not respond. Not a yes, not a no, just silence. And in diplomacy, silence like that is itself a kind of answer. It's the non-aligned playbook in motion, letting the absence of a reply do the talking instead of issuing a formal refusal that might damage the relationship. At the very same time, though, something else was happening behind the scenes, something that reveals just how much more complicated this story actually is. If this kind of story, the one that actually connects details most channels skip past, is changing how you see this war, tap that like button now. It helps far more people find this instead of the same 5 headlines everyone else keeps repeating. India had been quietly running a naval mission called Operation Sandkalp, a word that roughly translates to resolve or determination. It began years earlier, back in 2019, after a previous wave of tanker attacks in the Gulf, and it has continued ever since as India's ongoing effort to protect its own merchant ships passing through this region. As this new war escalated, India expanded that presence dramatically. Reports describe the Indian Navy deploying more than half a dozen warships and logistics vessels into the Gulf of Oman and the wider Arabian Sea, specifically to escort Indian-flagged tankers to safety. Notice the positioning here because it matters. These warships were stationed east of the Strait of Hormuz. They did not enter the strait itself. Their job was to pick up commercial vessels once those ships had already made it through the most dangerous stretch on their own, and then guide them the rest of the way to safer waters. That is an extraordinarily careful line to walk, present enough to matter, careful enough to avoid looking like a provocation aimed at Iran. At the time this escalation was unfolding, India reportedly had more than 20 of its own flagged vessels effectively stranded in or around the Persian Gulf, including ships carrying liquefied petroleum gas, liquefied natural gas, and crude oil. That is not an abstract inconvenience. That is India's actual energy supply chain, sitting exposed in one of the most volatile stretches of water on Earth. And this response didn't stay small. Over the following weeks, the operation grew into what amounted to a dedicated security corridor for tankers and merchant vessels as they made their way out of the strait. This wasn't a symbolic show of a flag or two. It was a sustained, resourced commitment of ships, fuel, and coordination, purpose-built for this exact crisis. So here's the tension at the heart of this whole story. On one hand, India stayed publicly silent when the United States asked for warships to join a multinational coalition. On the other hand, India was simultaneously building its own independent naval shield, entirely outside anyone else's command structure, specifically to protect its people and its energy supply. That's not contradiction, that's calculation. India wasn't choosing a side in this war. It was choosing to protect its own interests, without ever formally declaring which side it stood on. To really understand how significant that balancing act is, you need to see how much India had already done to stay on Iran's good side before any of this happened. In the weeks leading up to the April attack, India had gone out of its way to avoid antagonizing Tehran, even as tensions with the United States and Israel spiraled. Indian officials had spoken about direct conversations with Iran as one of the most effective ways to keep shipping moving through the strait, even while pressure was building elsewhere for a larger multinational naval force to secure the waterway through sheer numbers. That's India explicitly leaning toward quiet diplomacy instead of open military coordination, even while other nations were taking a very different path in that exact same stretch of water during that exact same window of time. France, Italy, and Greece, among others, were actively expanding their own naval protection missions in the wider Gulf region. A French diplomat confirmed that Paris was working with partners on a coordinated naval effort specifically aimed at keeping the strait open. That is the European approach, multinational, coordinated, openly tied to a broader Western security framework. India chose something different. It built its own separate independent capability instead, answering to no combined command, coordinating with no formal coalition, and staying as far from open politics as it possibly could, all while the actual military commitment underneath that quiet posture remained completely real. That contrast is really the whole story in miniature. While European navies leaned on decades-old alliance structures, India built something custom, fit to its own needs, deployed on its own terms, and kept deliberately distant from anyone else's flag. So now, here's the honest question worth sitting with. Given everything you've just heard, do you think India's approach here, independent naval protection paired with a sharp diplomatic rebuke, but never formally choosing a side, is actually the smartest way for a country like India to navigate a war this dangerous? Or does staying this determinedly neutral eventually become impossible the longer a conflict like this drags on? There's a human layer to this story that's easy to lose underneath all the talk of warships and diplomatic summons. India has one of the largest populations of professional sailors anywhere in the world. Every one of those tankers moving through Hormuz has real people on board, often dozens of Indian citizens on a single ship. Someone's father, someone's son, someone's husband or brother doing a job that was already demanding long before this war made it dangerous. That's part of why the April 18th attack carries weight, far beyond the geopolitics surrounding it. These weren't abstract vessels caught in an abstract dispute over shipping lanes. They were real ships, carrying real families, breadwinners, and back home, relatives spent that day in genuine fear the moment word of the attack started spreading, waiting for confirmation that their loved ones were safe. It's worth pausing on the uncertainty ordinary sailors have had to live with throughout this entire war, never fully knowing if the water ahead has actually been secured, never fully trusting that promises made by any government involved, including Iran's own repeated assurances about safe passage, will hold up once their ship is the one testing them. That is an extraordinary amount of pressure to carry into what is normally just a routine, demanding job, and it rarely gets the acknowledgement it deserves, in coverage that focuses only on the biggest headlines. Let's talk about what this whole episode actually reveals about where India stands in this war, because I think it's more layered than a simple story about one attack and one diplomatic protest. India isn't picking a side in the traditional sense. It hasn't joined the American coalition. It hasn't publicly branded Iran an enemy state. It hasn't sent warships to strike anyone. What India has done instead is something quieter, and in a lot of ways more sophisticated. It built an independent capability to protect its own interests, its own ships, its own energy supply, its own citizens, all without formally aligning with either side of this war. That is a genuinely difficult needle to thread, and most countries caught up in this conflict haven't even tried. The April 18th attack tested whether that balancing act could actually survive real pressure. India didn't respond with military force. It didn't send warships into the strait to confront the gunboats directly. But it also didn't stay quiet. Summoning an ambassador is a real diplomatic escalation, not a symbolic gesture for the cameras, and it came from a government that had spent the previous weeks doing everything it could to avoid exactly this kind of confrontation. That's the honest, complete picture of the line India crossed here, not a military line. India never fired a shot at Iran throughout any of this, and that needs to be said clearly so nobody walks away with the wrong impression. But a diplomatic and strategic line was crossed all the same. A shift from quiet, careful neutrality toward a noticeably more assertive posture. One willing to publicly and formally push back against Iran while still refusing to fully join anyone's coalition. That is a narrow position to hold, and April 18th appears to be the day it became clear India was willing to hold that line under real pressure, instead of collapsing into either full confrontation or total silence. There's a broader lesson buried inside all of this, too, about how a war between just a handful of countries can end up forcing nations with no stake in the original dispute into genuinely difficult choices. India depends heavily on energy imports that move through this exact waterway, and no amount of careful non-alignment doctrine changes the basic reality that its own citizens' safety and its own economic stability were directly on the line the moment those gunboats opened fire. That kind of pressure eventually forces even the most determinedly neutral countries to make real, consequential decisions. Watching how India threaded that needle is genuinely useful for understanding just how far this war's reach has actually extended, well beyond the two countries making the loudest headlines. Writing a story like this properly takes real digging, cross-checking maritime reports, government statements, and international coverage of a country that almost never gets this kind of attention in Western reporting on this war. If that kind of careful storytelling is what keeps you coming back to this channel, subscribe and turn on notifications, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told about how the rest of the world is actually experiencing this conflict, not just the two loudest countries in the room. So here's the bottom line on everything we've covered. India never fired a shot at Iran. It never joined an American-led coalition. It never publicly branded Iran an enemy state. Judged purely by the loudest, most obvious markers of a country entering a war, India stayed on the sidelines throughout this entire conflict, exactly as its decades-old policy of non-alignment would predict. But judged by what actually happened on the water, and inside the closed doors of diplomacy, a very different picture comes into focus. Warships deployed near an active conflict zone. A dedicated security corridor built specifically for this crisis. An ambassador summoned in one of the sharpest diplomatic protests of the entire war. None of that fits neatly into the traditional story of a neutral country simply staying above the fray. And that gap between the quiet, careful public messaging and the substantial, sustained action happening underneath it is exactly what makes this story worth telling in this much detail. That is the real line that got crossed here. Not a line between peace and war, but a line between passive neutrality and something far more active. A country quietly building genuine independent capability to protect its own people, while still publicly maintaining the language and posture of strict non-alignment. Whether that balancing act can hold if this war keeps dragging on, or whether India eventually reaches a moment where staying this careful becomes genuinely impossible, is honestly one of the more compelling open questions inside this entire broader conflict. I don't think anyone, including officials inside India's own government, could tell you with full confidence exactly how that plays out. What we do know is this. A country that spent decades avoiding confrontation, that stayed silent when a superpower directly asked for its help, still found itself forced to draw a line the moment its own people were put in danger. That tells you something bigger than a story about ships and diplomats. It tells you that neutrality has limits. Even the most careful, most disciplined neutrality in the world eventually meets a moment it cannot simply stay quiet through. Drop your honest take in the comments below about where you think this goes next. I read every single one, and I genuinely believe stories like this, ones that step outside the usual framing of just two countries fighting each other, add something real to the conversation. If you have any personal or family connection to India's maritime world, its sailors, or its foreign policy, I would love to hear it. Because a first-hand perspective on how this balancing act actually feels from the inside adds something no amount of outside reporting can fully capture. Thank you for sticking with a story that took us outside the usual headlines for once. Dozens of nations are being pulled into this conflict's orbit in ways that rarely make it into mainstream coverage, and there is real value in stepping back sometimes to show just how wide this war's footprint has actually become. If this video helped you see a side of this conflict you hadn't considered before, share it with someone who only follows the main headlines, and I'll see you in the next one.